everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Tracy and we're working with lace again. Sheer lace corsets are so trendy right now, so I wanted to show you guys how to make one. And this one has a lace up front as well as a lace up back. I recommend using a Ridgid lace for this project, and if you don't want it to be sheer, you can line the whole thing with cotton. I made a digital sewing pattern and it's available in my Etsy shop. I apologize for the limited sizing, that's just the size of my dress form, but I am planning in the next few months to work on grading all of my sewing patterns, so they'll be available in a range of sizes. I'll keep you guys updated on that, and I hope you guys enjoy this tutorial. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Items needed for this project include the sewing pattern, 100% cotton, some bridal net, not tulle, bridal net, and some Ridgid lace, as well as your sewing supplies, a 1/4" spiral steel boning and bone caps, as well as your wire cutters and pliers, 34B or 32C underwires, some twill tape for your bone channels, but you can also just make a 1/2" bias tape and make your channels yourself if you want to save some money, 1/4" ribbon for the lace up front, and some bridal elastic loop trim, lace trim for the hem finishes. You can also just use bias tape, and some underwire channel, as well as just ribbon for the lace up back. Cut out all of your pattern pieces, and on the pattern I indicate how many pieces to cut out of which fabrics. So now we can just start with pattern piece number 1. Layer the lace right on top of one cotton piece, and you're going to take the other cotton, and this is going to be the lining for pattern 1, so you're just going to place that right on top. And you're just going to sew the left side a 1/2" seam allowance. I pin the layers together and I take it to the sewing machine and just sew a 1/2". After sewing that 1/2" seam allowance, I just open up the lining and push the seam allowance towards it. And we're just going to do a understitch right next to that seam, so about a 1/16 inch away from that seam. So just stitching really close, and this will allow the fabric to turn back. After understitching, just fold the lining back and just pin that in place and take it to the sewing machine and do a top stitch very close to the edge, about a 1/8 inch away. From that stitch, just stitch 3/8 inch away for a bone channel. Number 1 is sewn. So now you're going to take pattern piece number 2, and that is the lace and the net. So you first want to just do a basting stitch on the left side on that seam. You just want to baste those 2 layers together just so it doesn't move. I just sewed a 1/4 inch. As you can see, now both layers are sewn together on that left side, and now you want to attach 2 and 1 together, so you're just going to place wrong sides together. All of the seams are going to be sewn towards the outside because the bone channels will cover that seam allowance. And I'm just sewing a 1/2" seam allowance, and just don't forget to back tack. After attaching panels 2 to 1, I just baste the other side of panel 2 so the net and the lace are together, and I just sew a 1/4 inch again. And that's what it looks like basted. So I'm going to just take pattern piece number 3 and baste the net and the lace together like I just did on the other piece, and I'm sewing that left side like that. And now that both layers are basted, I'm just going to take pattern piece 3 and 2 and place wrong sides together. I'm just pinning them and just easing the seams if needed. I just kind of pin the bottom and the top first, so then I can just ease everything else in when I'm like pinning a curve. I take it to the sewing machine and just sew a 1/2" seam allowance. And I do this again, so I baste the other side of that pattern piece a 1/4 inch, as well as taking pattern piece 4 and basting those 2 layers together. And then I take pattern 4 and attach it to 3 by placing wrong sides together. After attaching pattern piece number 4, now we have to do the back panel, the last one, which is 5. So you're going to just start by taking a layer of cotton and placing the lace right on top of it. And and you're just going to baste both layers together on the center back seam. And for the lining, you're just going to take a piece of cotton and the net and place the net right on top of that and pin the center back and baste it together. Once the center back is basted, you're just going to take your lining and place it right on top of your lace, so the net's going to face the lace, and you're just going to pin the center back and take it to the sewing machine and sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Just like we did with pattern piece number 1, we're just going to push the lining to one side as well as the seam allowance to that same side, and we're going to do an understitch right on top of the lining, so you're just stitching a 1/16 of an inch away from that seam. After doing that understitch, you can see that lining just rolls back so easily, and you just want to pin the center back completely flat and just take it to the sewing machine and do an 1/8 of an inch top stitch right next to the very edge. And from that top stitch, you're just going to sew a 3/8 of an inch bone channel. The center back is clean finished now, so you can just baste the other side all together so none of the layers move, and just take pattern piece 5 and attach it to 4. So place wrong sides together and sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance. The seam will be on the outside. And repeat this to the other side. So now you have the bottom of the bustier shell all completely sewn, and now you want to just trim all of your seam allowance to a 1/4 inch. Time for the bone channels. This is probably my favorite part. So I'm just taking my twill tape. You can also use bias, so just make your own 1/2 inch bias tape. You can see how the bone channels look on the left side panel, and you want to just push your seam allowance towards the center back for the first 2 seams, and the next 2 seams you want to push those towards the center front, if that makes sense. So just go in the directions I'm pointing. I find it easier to just not pin the bone channels. I like to just go to my sewing machine and just place the bone channel right on top of my garment as I sew. So I leave like a tail at the end and then just place it right on top of that seam while pushing the seam allowance in the direction I need it. And I just make sure it's lined up as I sew, so I just take it slowly, and if I have a curve I like stop and just pivot if I need to and just follow the exact seam. As you can see, I'm just sewing really close to the edge. And then after I finish sewing one side down, I just turn it over and sew the other side down. So I'm stitching at the very edge again, as you can see, and you want to just hold the fabric taut and just make it super flat so you don't get any puckers when you're sewing it. I just repeat this and do it to all of the seams. I apply the bone channel and just sew on either side. The bone channels are such a nice touch when you're working with sheer fabric, so I'm just going to start by trimming the excess of the bone channels at the center of the gore, and then I just take a ruler and mark a 1/4 inch on the center front just so I know where my first loop is going to start. I take the bridal elastic loop trim and just figure out where I'm going to place the first loop, so right at the edge of that 1/4 inch mark, and then I just take it to the sewing machine and place it right in between that bone channel and the center front, which is exactly on that seam that we covered, so right in the middle. And I'm just doing a straight stitch and just sewing all the way down, and I'm using a small stitch size, so for this whole project just keep everything at a stitch size 2. And just repeat this to the other side, and now your center front has the loops for the lace up ribbon. Take it to my overlock machine and just overlock the top of the gore so everything's clean finish, and I trimmed the rest of the loops at the top. And then I just fold the gore down a 1/4 inch and just pin it down and just do a top stitch. You can also just do a zigzag stitch to clean finish the end, and then just fold it under and do the 1/4 inch top stitch. And when you do the top stitch, you might just have to back tack when you get to the loops, and then you're just gonna have to put the loop push it towards the back so you can like stitch the rest of it. I hope that makes sense, or else you're just gonna stitch through that loop and you actually need it for function. So after clean finishing the gores, we're gonna sew in the cups, and they're so pretty. So we're going to just set aside the bottom part of the bustier and just focus on the cup. So you're just gonna take your lace and the net for the cup, and you're just gonna pin it all down together, and you're just gonna baste the top part of the cup. Just take it to the sewing machine and do an 1/8 of an inch baste. After the top part of the bottom cup is basted, just make sure you have your notches marked on the top piece and the bottom piece of the cup. And you're just gonna start pinning the center front, the notch, and the side seams together, and just make sure you know your center front and side seam on your cup. I've indicated on the pattern because you just don't want to mess up your side seam and the center front, because the piece can easily flip and you can mix what side is what. So just make sure you mark it on your pattern piece, because trust me, you can sew in your cups in a different direction and it just doesn't fit properly. After pinning right sides together, so the seam will be on the inside for the cup, you're just going to take it to the sewing machine and stitch 1/4 inch. After sewing that seam, you're going to just take your seam allowance and push it towards the bottom of the cup, like so. And on the inside of the cup, you're going to just take it to the sewing machine and just stitch a top stitch. So it's about 1/8 of an inch away from that seam. And remember, you're pushing it towards the bottom part of the cup and just stitching right on top of it. And you're just going to want to hold the fabric taut so nothing puckers, and it's going to lay really flat and give shape to your cup. Once the cup is sewn, you can just attach it to the bottom part of the bustier, and I like to take my ruler and just mark the 1/4 inch seam allowance so I know where to attach the lace at the center front of the gore so it lines up properly with the gore. So I just pin the cup at the center front. I pin the armhole, so just make sure you mark the notch on the cup so you know where that armhole ends, and just pin it in place. With the rest of the cup, you're going to just stretch and ease it into the underbust. So as you can see, I'm just stretching and molding that together so everything lines up properly, and trust me, when you stretch and mold, the cup will fit perfectly fine. I take it to the sewing machine and just sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance for the cup. I take the underwire channel and just cut out a 9-inch piece and pinned the other side down so you can see how the wire channel looks. I have an in-depth tutorial on how to do wire channel on my recent Regency bustier tutorial. So for a little refresher, I'm just trimming the seam allowance, so instead of it being a 1/4 inch, it's going to be 3/16, just so you can't see the seam allowance when the wire channel is above it. Push your seam allowance towards the top of the cup and take your wire channel. You see that there's a chain stitch right on your wire channel, and you're just going to match up that stitch with the seam on your cup. So you just want to pin that in place, and you're going to have to like stretch your cup to fit the wire channel, and you're just going to have to do this slowly and stretch with patience. And I know it gets difficult, so just a lot of pins are your friends in this situation. And then you're just going to baste everything in place with just a needle and thread so you can get rid of all of those pins. I take it to the sewing machine after I've basted the wire channel, and I stitch right on top of that chain stitch on the wire channel. So it's good to just be stitching on the inside of the bustier so you can see the wire channel, and just stitching right on top of that stitch so I can follow that line. And then when I do the other stitch, I'm just sewing a 1/4 inch away from that stitch. I almost forgot to add a bone channel to the center back because it's supposed to be a bone, then your grommets, and then a bone on the other side of your grommets just to stabilize everything at the center back. So just mark 3/8 of an inch away from that bone channel so you know where to line up your twill tape or bias tape for your bone channel next to it. And I just sewed it down like my other bone channel, so now you have another bone, and in between you're going to have the grommets. And next you just want to trim all the excess at the armhole. So I'm just overlocking the armhole with my overlock machine, but you can also just trim your excess and do a zigzag stitch to finish. And I only did this because I'm going to be putting that lace trim at the armholes. But if you're going to do bias tape, it's not necessary to clean finish because it would have been encased in your bias. So you can follow my corset tutorials on how to apply bias tape if you need a tutorial on that. But as you can see, I just placed this lace trim right at the armhole, and I'm just lining up the low point to the top of the armhole and just doing a 3-step zigzag to secure the lace in place. After finishing the armholes with the lace, I just trim the excess at the center back and the strap point, and then I just take it to the sewing machine and do a zigzag stitch, like casting over, so I can just like clean that end and secure it in place. I finally went to Home Depot and got the better wire cutters, so this made my life so much easier. Just cut your bones like under a piece of fabric, just because the pieces fly everywhere. So I just take my bones after I've tipped them and just sandwich them in between the seam allowance and the twill tape. And when I'm putting the bones in the cotton pieces, just make sure it's in between both layers of cotton, so you won't see it on the inside like you will on the sheer parts. And if you need an in-depth tutorial on how to cut bones and tip them, you can watch my Regency Bustier video and I go over that. And after all the bones are put in, now it's time to finish the hem. So I just take it to my overlock machine and just overlock the hem, and just repeating that same exact process of the lace trim, but you can also just use bias tape to finish your hem. And the only difference is at the hem, when you reach like that princess bottom point, because it's like a V shape, you're going to just like pleat that trim so it matches up with like the bone, and then it can just like be sewn on the other side at the perfect angle. My hand's kind of blocking what I'm doing, but I'm just pleating that trim and then just pivoting my foot so I can sew on the other direction. Now I'm taking the 1/4" ribbon and just lacing the center front. So I just start at the bottom, and I decided to skip every other loop so you can actually see the ribbon crossing. And when I reach the top of the gore, I just tie a bow, and you can actually just knot it and then do the bow because you don't need this lace up to function. The only part that's going to actually function is the back lacing. I went to the garment district to get my grommets done, and on the sewing pattern I indicate the placement. I also attached adjustable straps, and if you need an in-depth tutorial I will link one. And just don't forget to put in your underwire. I forgot to film that part, and just stitch at the center front. Final garment is so dreamy, and I can't wait to see all of your guys' creations, so just tag me on Instagram, and thank you guys so much for watching.